She said that he didn't belong in business class, then froze when the flight attendant told her she just insulted the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré. Her flight had been delayed twice already. Alina Schroeder tapped her manicured nails against her boarding pass as she waited in line at Gate 19B in Istanbul. She hated flying into West Africa. Dusty airports, poor Wi-Fi, and customs officers who asked too many questions. Still, her firm insisted on these quarterly trips. Show presence, maintain rapport with the partners, they said. So here she was, boarding a Turkish Airlines flight to Ouagadougou. She wore a tan linen blazer, dark slacks, and designer heels, dressed just enough to suggest importance, but not flashy. Her phone buzzed with one last email from a colleague in Berlin. She answered curtly, "Boarding now. We'll circle back after landing. Assume no proper network for next 10 HRs." The line moved. Alina made sure she got on early enough to claim overhead space before the late arrivals hogged it. She walked through the jet bridge with the air of someone who believed she was the most competent person in the room. Any room. As she reached her seat, 2A, window, she glanced around, quietly assessing the cabin. Mostly businessmen, NGO reps, a few government types, all keeping to themselves. She tucked her bag above and sat down, adjusting the seatbelt like it was a seat on the board of a major investment bank. The first-class section was clean, sleek, efficient. The kind of cabin she felt belonged to people like her, educated, cultured, pragmatic, not unpredictable. She placed her laptop bag at her feet, then called the flight attendant for a glass of water. Sparkling, if possible, room temperature. Soon after, another passenger entered the cabin. He walked without urgency. No suitcase, just a canvas satchel slung over his shoulder. Military fatigue pants, a plain black shirt, and dusty boots. Alina looked up briefly, then back at her phone. Then she heard him stop. Seat 2B. He sat down next to her. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She felt the shift, the presence of someone who didn't quite fit. She kept scrolling. 5 seconds passed, then 10, and then a breath. She spoke softly in French, not turning her head. Figures they're letting anyone in here these days. Not loud, just enough to express annoyance, just enough to feel like she still had some control over her space. The man didn't react. Alina reached for the flight attendant call button. When the attendant arrived, she smiled tightly and gestured with her hand, leaning in. "Is there any chance I can switch seats? Somewhere more comfortable?" The attendant paused just for a second. Her eyes went from Alina to the man in 2B, then back to Alina. She bent down slightly and whispered, "Madam, that's President Ibrahim Traoré." Alina blinked. "Excuse me?" The attendant gave a polite smile. "President of Burkina Faso." For a moment, everything slowed. Alina stared forward, then to the side, then at him. He hadn't moved. Still sitting calmly, hands resting on his lap, gaze forward like he was watching clouds pass through bulletproof glass. Alina felt a heat crawl up her neck. Her fingers twitched slightly. She straightened her blazer. "Oh, I didn't realize," she began. He didn't turn his head. She glanced around. No one else seemed to be reacting, but she felt eyes, she wasn't sure from where. She cleared her throat. "Well, I suppose we'll have an interesting flight then." No answer. She hated silence. It always forced her to hear herself. She extended her hand halfway. "Alina, from Munich." He didn't take it. "I work in infrastructure, development consulting." Still nothing. The plane doors closed. The wheels began to roll. And next to her sat a man who had been fighting for his country while she was arguing over coffee budgets in Berlin. But the real turbulence hadn't started yet. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane ascended. A quiet hush settled over business class. Tray tables down, seatbelts clicked, drinks poured. Alina fidgeted with the edge of her silk scarf, eyes darting to the man beside her. He hadn't touched the drink the attendant offered. Just water. No small talk, no magazine, not even a glance at the in-flight screen. He sat there like he'd flown this route 100 times. unmoved by altitude or attitude. Alina, meanwhile, was unraveling in silence. She replayed the moment in her head again and again, the words she muttered, the way the flight attendant looked at her. The title, President, echoed like an accusation. No entourage, no suit, no briefcase. Who boards a flight like that looking like a soldier and turns out to be a head of state? She looked over again. Still nothing. She felt like a child who had been caught writing on the wall. But instead of scolding, the teacher had simply stared. That kind of silence? It wasn't passive. It was deliberate. The attendant came by again with the meal service, chicken or pasta. "Pasta," Alina said, smiling too wide. "And for the president, I assume?" The attendant glanced at him. "Same." He didn't say a word. Alina picked at her food, unsure of her own appetite. The cabin had become a stage. Every movement suddenly had weight. She couldn't even enjoy the pasta. It felt like chewing cardboard under judgment. After 20 minutes, she turned to him, clearing her throat. "Look, about earlier, I didn't realize who you were. My comment, well, it wasn't meant personally, just a misunderstanding, that's all." "Nothing," she continued anyway. "It's just that sometimes people sneak into first class and it throws off the vibe. You understand how that can happen, right?" His head turned slightly, for the first time since the plane took off. Eyes on hers, not angry, just sharp, unapologetically clear. "Respect is not something you offer after the fact," he said. His voice was low, steady, and final. Then he turned away again. Alina sat back slowly. No one else in the cabin reacted, but she felt like someone had thrown a cold bucket of water on her self-importance. She didn't know what to say. She had flown first class dozens of times, met ambassadors, CEOs, ministers. They all came with titles and business cards glad-handing and self-advertising. None had spoken like that. Few had made her feel so small. She tried one last time. "It's just, you caught me off guard. I mean, no offense, but I assumed..." Her voice trailed off as she realized what she was about to say. She assumed everything about this flight, about him, had been filtered through her assumptions. Who deserved what seat? Who looked like power? Who belonged where? And now, here she was, fumbling next to someone who hadn't even acknowledged her status. Someone who didn't have to explain himself. Someone who didn't ask for the spotlight, but carried it with him anyway. The worst part? He wasn't being cruel. He wasn't even trying to embarrass her. He just didn't care what she thought, and that made it hurt more. The cabin lights dimmed further. A few passengers put on sleep masks. Others adjusted their chairs to recline. Alina pulled a travel pillow from her bag and placed it behind her neck. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and felt nothing but the weight of her own arrogance pressing on her chest. She reached for her blanket and paused. He was asleep now, or at least resting, eyes shut, breathing even. She studied him for a moment, his features, the slight scarring on his left hand, the way his posture remained upright even in sleep. There was something in him, something she didn't understand. Not charm, not charisma, something else, something quieter, something earned. Alina looked away and stared out the window into the dark sky, but the silence between them had just started to spread beyond their row. The engines hummed beneath the cabin floor as the flight cruised high above the Mediterranean. A calmness hung in the air, but inside Alina, everything felt tight, like a rubber band stretched too far, waiting to snap. She hadn't touched her wine. It sat there untouched on her tray table. Her mind kept circling the same thought. President. She called him just anyone, Jao. A president without a suit, without polished shoes or a leather briefcase, just a man in worn boots and plain fatigues, and still, somehow more composed, more commanding than anyone she'd met at a summit. What gnawed at her wasn't just that she'd made a mistake. It was the way he absorbed her words and let them fall without ever chasing her apology. He didn't need to win. He had already won something she didn't even know was at stake. A few rows behind them, a younger man in economy class recognized him. He nudged the person beside him. "C'est lui, le capitaine, Ibrahim Traoré." Soon a subtle murmur passed from row to row. Someone opened Twitter. Another searched Traoré, Burkina Faso. The news wasn't loud. It moved like a ripple, quiet but undeniable. Eyes in business class began darting towards seat 2B, quickly looking away when he shifted even slightly. One passenger near the bulkhead took a blurry photo. Nothing invasive, just a quick snap between the seats. The man in 4A whispered to his wife in Dioula, "He's the one who stood up to France, the one who said no more to the military bases." She whispered back, "He's the one who refused the luxury car convoys. He still walks to markets with his people." None of this reached Alina directly, but she could feel it. The weight of recognition was moving in the cabin, not loud, not fast, but steady. She reached for her phone and quickly searched his name. First result, Ibrahim Traoré, transitional president of Burkina Faso. Second, the youngest head of state in Africa. Third, known for rejecting luxury and remaining close to the people. She scrolled further, skimming headlines. Traoré declines private jet, flies commercial. Burkinabe president dismisses bodyguards on official trip. Calls for justice, independence, and African dignity. Her mouth went dry. All the metrics that mattered to her, wealth, attire, polish, LinkedIn titles, none of them applied to him. And yet, he had more command than any Fortune 500 exec she'd ever tried to impress. She turned toward him again, still resting, still unreadable. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, not just to clear her own guilt, but because suddenly she was curious, not about his resume, but about how someone like him carried so much without saying a word. "Excuse me," she whispered. His eyes opened slowly. "I read about you," she continued, softer now. You've done a lot for your people." He didn't respond, not with words, but the slightest narrowing of his eyes told her he was listening. She took a breath, pushing past her own discomfort. "I judged you," she admitted, "right away. I assumed—" "You did more than judge," he interrupted. His voice wasn't harsh, just steady. "You assigned value, you saw what I wore, and decided I didn't belong." She sat in silence. "I've seen that look," he added, turning to face her. "From soldiers with medals, from diplomats in palaces, from people who shake your hand and wash theirs afterward." Alina looked down at her hands. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "That's the point," he replied. "You didn't care to." The words weren't cruel, they were just facts, and somehow that made them worse. He leaned back again, closing his eyes once more. She turned toward the window, unsure what hurt more, being wrong or realizing she'd never really questioned how often she was. But the flight wasn't over, and neither was the lesson. An hour passed, maybe more. The cabin grew quiet except for the soft rustle of blankets and trays being cleared. A few overhead screens played a muted documentary on desert elephants. Alina wasn't watching. She stared forward, arms crossed, pretending to sleep. But her eyes kept drifting to the man beside her, still calm, still unreadable. Not a single sigh, not a single twitch of discomfort. Just breath, slow and steady, like time didn't bother him anymore. She envied that. There were a dozen things she wanted to say, maybe more, but every sentence she rehearsed in her head sounded worse than the one before, and every word he'd said still echoed. Respect is not something you offer after the fact. It had carved its place in her, because it wasn't theatrical. It wasn't delivered with fury or venom. It was unshakable. Like someone who didn't raise his voice because life had already raised it for him 100 times before. She turned to him quietly. "I want to ask you something," she said. His eyes opened, slow but alert. He didn't answer, just looked at her, waiting. "Why don't you travel with a delegation, or at least a few security guards?" He exhaled through his nose, then replied simply, "I don't need anyone to carry silence for me." Alina blinked. He continued, "The ones who fear their people are the ones who hide behind others. If I can't sit among them, eat with them, listen to them, what am I leading?" She wanted to challenge that. Her instincts were trained to question efficiency, risk, protocol, but she knew the question wasn't welcome. It was rhetorical, and it came from a place of lived certainty. "You're not afraid?" she asked. He shook his head. "I'm more afraid of forgetting why I started." Alina leaned back into her seat, chewing that over. He didn't posture, he didn't brag. He spoke like someone who'd spent too long being ignored to waste time explaining himself now. She whispered again, "You don't have to talk to me, you know." "I'm not," he said plainly. "I'm talking because others are listening." He gestured subtly to the seats behind them. It was then that Alina realized some passengers had been following every word, discreetly, quietly, but they were there, and that shifted something. This wasn't just a personal correction, this was public accountability. Her mistake didn't just belong to her anymore. She looked down at her lap. "I deserve this," she murmured. He turned his head fully this time, eyes locked on hers. "No," he said, "you deserve to sit with it. There's a difference." That landed hard. He wasn't trying to shame her. He wasn't even punishing her. He was just naming the cost and refusing to take on the emotional labor for her guilt. She swallowed. "I've worked in development for 15 years, she offered, a last grasp at credibility. "Infrastructure, community design, logistics. I've always tried to help." He didn't smile, didn't sneer, just said, "Helping isn't the same as listening. You were paid to speak, not to hear." That cut deeper than she expected, because it was true. Her work had always been through the lens of solutions, budgets, efficiency. She spoke on behalf of people she had never once sat beside on a plane. Until now. He leaned back again, closing his eyes. Conversation over, and this time she didn't push it. Not because she was embarrassed, but because she knew he had already given her more than he needed to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was loaded. Every second held weight, not resentment, but something heavier. The kind of silence that doesn't yell. It just waits for you to stop lying to yourself. Alina closed her eyes too, not to sleep, just to stop thinking for a moment. But while the cabin rested, the story was still moving without a single word needing to be added. He remembered the road to Wahaguya, not the political meetings or security briefings, but the dust, the sun on his back, and the quiet that came with responsibility too big for his age. He had been 22 when he buried his closest friend after an ambush near the border. That day didn't come with headlines. Just a wooden cross, a few words, and a resolve he didn't know was still growing inside him. Now, sitting beside a woman who couldn't look him in the eye without flinching, Ibrahim Traoré let his mind drift, not out of boredom, but memory. She had asked why he didn't travel with guards, as if leadership required protection from the very people it claimed to serve. That wasn't the kind of power he believed in. He thought back to a moment 3 years ago, when he'd walked alone into a village where half the population had been displaced. There were no cameras, no speech, just a promise made to a mother sitting beside a cooking fire. Her son had died 2 weeks earlier in a skirmish that wasn't even acknowledged by the state. She didn't cry, she just stared at him and said, "If you want to lead, don't show up with flags. Show up when no one else does." He never forgot her face. She wore a faded yellow scarf and hands like dried earth. That one encounter changed the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he wore plain clothes and refused to sit behind bulletproof glass. She had shown him something every conference had failed to teach: humility without pity, grief without noise, truth without theatrics. And now, next to him sat a woman who had spent her career developing systems without once seeing what it meant to be failed by them. He didn't hate her. In fact, he understood her, because once he too had looked at a room full of strangers and thought status was the same as worth. That was before the betrayal, before the friend who took a bribe, before the general who smiled at him in the day and sold his people's future at night. He learned quickly, power doesn't corrupt, comfort does. That's why he stayed uncomfortable, why he chose economy class more often than not, why he still wore boots worn down by real terrain, not polished for red carpets. His first uniform? Bought secondhand. His first weapon? Shared with 3 others. There was no ceremony, no national anthem, just orders that never made it to the public, and wounds that didn't show on paper. He remembered the day he led his first operation as captain. He had been told to expect 20 rebels. There were 70, and they had more weapons than his entire unit combined. He won't ever forget the eyes of the teenager he pulled from the rubble afterward. The kid didn't thank him, just stared, bleeding, afraid, and barely breathing. There was no victory speech, no post-op photo, just more silence. That silence stayed with him longer than any medal. Now, as the plane floated thousands of feet above the countries he once walked through in battered shoes, he remained still, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew most people didn't know how to hear, especially the ones who thought themselves educated, the ones like her. Alina had been quiet for a while now. She wasn't pretending to sleep anymore. Her posture had softened, her crossed arms now rested in her lap, fingers tracing invisible patterns. She was trying to figure out how to make this right. He could tell. But it wasn't about right. It wasn't about fixing one moment on one flight. It was about the way people like her move through the world, the weight of assumption they carried, the fact that she didn't know the difference between pity and equality. That wasn't her fault alone, but it was her responsibility. Ibrahim exhaled slowly, eyes still closed. No part of him wanted to humiliate her. She'd already done that to herself. What mattered more was that she carried this with her after the landing. Because words fade, but shame, that stays if you're lucky. And sometimes shame is the only thing that wakes people up. But the cabin wasn't asleep anymore. Something was shifting in the air, and soon, so was the narrative. Alina shifted in her seat, eyes darting toward the aisle. The air around her felt denser than it had an hour ago. Not hotter, just heavier. Not claustrophobic, but exposed. And she could feel it. She wasn't imagining the sideways glances. A man in 3D stood up to stretch his legs. He paused briefly just beside her row, eyes brushing over Ibrahim before continuing. The woman seated in 1C leaned toward her travel companion, whispering in Wolof and pointing discreetly. A man in economy came up to use the business class lavatory, and as he passed, he gave a slight nod. Not to Alina, but to Ibrahim. That one, he returned. Alina caught it all. She turned back to the window, jaw clenched. It had begun hours earlier. A quiet click of camera phones. A name passed between rows. A fact repeated, reshared, confirmed. That's him. That's the president. He doesn't fly private. He's not just visiting, he's one of us. The cabin hadn't erupted into stares or chatter. No, it was subtler than that. The energy had changed. The awareness was present now. People saw him, and they saw her. She tried to ignore it, but shame is hard to swallow when you know others are chewing it for you. Ibrahim hadn't moved, hadn't checked his phone, hadn't flinched at the attention. He didn't react at all. He didn't need to. It was everyone else doing the reacting now, and it wasn't just awe or curiosity. It was quiet reverence. The kind people reserve for someone who's done the hard thing and kept doing it long after the cameras left. Alina knew this energy. She'd seen it in conferences when Nobel winners walked in, when activists who had survived prison spoke from podiums. But this was different. No stage, no applause, just presence. And now her moment, her comment, was floating through that space like smoke. The woman in 3A turned briefly and caught Alina's eye. Just a glance. But it said everything. You were the one who said that. You were the one who asked to be moved." Alina looked away again. She suddenly remembered a conversation she had over coffee in Brussels 2 months earlier, an internal joke between expats about who really ran African governments. "Power's in the private jets and hotel lobbies," one man had said. "The ones in uniform just sign papers." She'd laughed. Everyone at the table had. But now, staring at the man beside her, she realized he was the one in the lobby, and the battlefield, and the market, and the convoy she'd once watched pass through Zorgho without ever realizing who was inside. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down. A WhatsApp message from her colleague in Ouagadougou. "Is it true you're on the same flight as Traoré?" Then another. "People on Twitter say someone disrespected him on board. Please tell me it wasn't you." Her heart sank. The story was out, somehow, already. She looked at Ibrahim again. He hadn't checked his phone once, but maybe he didn't need to. Maybe he already knew how fast stories move when truth is involved. She opened her app to search for it, but stopped herself. What would it change? She didn't want to see the retweets. She didn't want to see her face attached to a sentence she couldn't erase. She swallowed hard and set her phone face down on the tray. Across the aisle, someone whispered again, this time too softly to make out. But the timing was unmistakable, right as Alina shifted in her seat. She couldn't hide. She'd been seen, not for her role, not for her position, not even for her error, but for what that error represented. And she knew it. For the first time, she understood what it felt like to be judged before speaking, to have your value assumed by strangers, to have your presence questioned, your space challenged, your worth debated, without your name even being mentioned. It wasn't subtle, it was sharp. She turned her face toward the window, eyes closed, pretending again. But this time, she wasn't pretending to sleep. She was pretending she could turn back the clock. But the truth had already landed long before the plane ever would. Alina couldn't take it anymore. She sat stiffly in her seat, knees drawn in, hands gripping the blanket like it was a shield. Every slight movement from a fellow passenger made her twitch. She felt stripped bare, not by noise, but by attention. She never asked for, and now couldn't escape. She'd flown hundreds of times before, shuffled past diplomats, sat beside CEOs, shared cab rides with high-level consultants. But never, not once, had she felt like the least important person in the room. Until now. And it wasn't about status, not really. It was about weight. This man beside her, he carried weight, not the kind measured in resume pages or salary digits. Something heavier, something no training in Brussels or policy meetings in Geneva could prepare you for. She couldn't just sit with it anymore. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a polished business card, and turned toward him with a strained smile. "I know you probably think I'm one of those foreigners who come and go without understanding anything," she said, her voice low but urgent. "But I'm not like that." He didn't respond. "I work in long-term planning, sustainability projects. I've led over 70 infrastructure initiatives across the region. We don't just advise, we build, we listen, You speak," he interrupted quietly without turning his head. "You speak more than you listen." The words dropped like a pin into silence. Her hand, still holding the card, hovered awkwardly in the space between them. "I'm offering this in good faith," she said, pushing a little. In case there's ever a moment where cooperation could matter. I could be useful." He turned his head now, slow, precise. "You want me to keep your name after this flight?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "Ask yourself something," he continued. "If I had been someone else, just a farmer in those same boots, no title, would you still offer that card?" She didn't answer, because the answer was no. She knew it. "I'm trying to take responsibility," she whispered, more defensive now. "No," he said. "You're trying to clean it up before it stains you." That hit harder than she expected. She leaned back, slowly drawing her card away. Her hand trembled just slightly. From across the aisle, a man in a gray shirt and wire-frame glasses cleared his throat. "I saw what happened," he said softly. His accent placed him somewhere between Senegal and Mauritania. "At the beginning of the flight, your tone, the request for another seat." Alina turned, startled. "I'm not here to accuse," he added. "I just want to remind you, this cabin isn't a courtroom. You don't get to plead your case after the judgment." She stared at him, blinking. "And I don't care where you went to school," he said before turning back to his book. The sting was instant. Alina wasn't used to this. In her world, mistakes could be finessed, reframed, contextualized. Everything had a spin. But here, 35,000 feet above land, there was no PR firm, no exit strategy, just witnesses. She sat frozen, business card still in hand, realizing she'd just tried to network her way out of shame. She looked again at Ibrahim. He had returned to stillness. His head leaned back, eyes shut, not asleep, but utterly done with her. And that stung more than any insult ever could. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't embarrassed her. He simply refused to offer her a version of himself that made her feel better. He didn't give her the closure she wanted. And maybe she thought that was the point, because real accountability doesn't come with a bow. It's messy, uncomfortable, hard. She slowly tore the business card in half beneath the blanket and let the pieces rest in her lap. Not out of guilt, but because she finally understood that some moments are not meant to be redeemed, only remembered. But the descent was beginning, and gravity always brings more than just the plane down. The seatbelt signs chimed on. Alina barely heard them. Her ears were still ringing from the silence. Her thoughts raced faster than the descent. She looked out the window, searching for something. Familiarity, comfort, a landmark, anything to remind her that she'd once arrived in this city feeling sure of herself. But today was different. As the plane dipped lower, the dusty outline of Ouagadougou emerged, rooftops flat against the horizon, red earth winding between narrow streets, people moving like threads in a weaving pattern far more complex than any she'd tried to map in a presentation. Passengers sat upright, tray tables locked, eyes alert now. The landing wasn't just physical, it felt like something heavier was about to hit the ground. Ibrahim sat quietly, hands resting lightly on his knees. He hadn't spoken again since their last exchange. He didn't have to. The captain announced arrival. People started gathering their things, but no one near the front stood up. They were waiting. As the plane rolled toward the gate, a quiet buzz, not from engines or overhead lights, but from attention, settled into the cabin. When the aircraft finally stopped, the door cracked open and warm air drifted in. 3 men stood outside waiting on the jet bridge. No weapons, no fanfare, just posture, upright, composed, and watchful. One of them carried a manila folder. Another had a tablet. They weren't bodyguards, they were aides, civil, professional. The lead one stepped onto the plane, scanned the cabin, and simply said, "Monsieur le Président." Ibrahim stood. He took his canvas satchel, nodded once to the man across the aisle, gave a single glance backward toward economy, then began walking slowly toward the door. No speech, no announcement, no handshake with Alina, just presence, deliberate, unforced. As he passed the other passengers, several lowered their heads respectfully. Some whispered his name, others just watched. And Alina, she stayed seated, frozen. No part of her wanted to follow him. Not physically, at least. She wanted to sit there and vanish, to be invisible again. But invisibility wasn't hers anymore. She'd surrendered that the moment she judged the man who didn't ask for her attention, but took it all the same. When she finally rose and exited the aircraft, she stepped into the heat like it was punishment. The Ouagadougou air felt heavier today, or maybe that was just her conscience. Inside the airport terminal, local journalists waited, not for her, not for her colleagues, but for a glimpse of the man they'd learned to watch closely. There were no cameras, no microphones shoved in his face, just quiet awareness. He passed through with the same calmness he'd had on the plane. One reporter took a single photo from a respectful distance. It would later go viral, not because of what he wore or what he said, but because of who stood behind him in the shot. Alina, looking like she had seen something she could never unsee. She walked past customs slowly, no urgency in her steps. No one stopped her, no one asked questions. But the looks lingered, like shadows cast in daylight. Outside, her driver was already waiting. "Ms. Schroeder," he greeted. "Everything all right?" She nodded barely. "Just drive," she whispered. As they pulled out of the airport, she checked her phone again. Messages flooded in. Twitter's going wild. "They're saying you were disrespectful to him. Do not comment yet, let it die down." But it wouldn't die down. It was just beginning. The photo from the plane had already surfaced. A tweet from someone in economy described the moment. The story was traveling faster than any plane. Retweets, quotes, opinion threads, even satire accounts had picked it up, and the captions weren't kind. Power doesn't wear a tie. Silence speaks louder when it's earned. She asked to move. Life moved her instead. Alina stared at the screen and felt something tighten inside her chest. Not panic, not humiliation, recognition. This was the moment she realized how little she understood about the places she'd claimed to help, how much she'd filtered through her own lens, how many times she had looked but not seen. Ibrahim Traoré hadn't given her a speech. He gave her a mirror. But reflections don't fade when the world starts watching. They grow sharper with distance. The hotel lobby was cold, polished, and far too quiet. Alina sat in a beige leather chair, her phone vibrating every few minutes with updates from Europe. Her company's communications team was already in damage control mode, drafting neutral statements and scheduling a call with the regional director. They wanted to clarify the situation and manage the narrative. But Alina couldn't even bring herself to reply. There was no narrative to manage. It had already been written by passengers who saw, by locals who recognized, and by millions who didn't need a press release to understand what had happened. She clicked open her Twitter feed. The top post, a photo of Traoré walking through the Ouagadougou terminal. He wasn't posing. He wasn't waving. Just walking, alone, upright, carrying the same satchel he had stowed beneath his seat. Behind him in the frame was her. Her face told the whole story, no caption needed. But the captions came anyway. Some lessons don't need a classroom. This is what dignity looks like next to discomfort. One seat, two worlds. She scrolled down, feeling each sentence land like a dull knock inside her chest. The comments were split. Some mocked her. Others offered excuses, said she'd made a mistake that she couldn't have known. But the truth sat quietly in the middle. Undeniable, she hadn't seen him. Not because he was invisible, but because she had chosen not to. And now, every tweet, every blog post, every quiet discussion around digital campfires across the continent, each one added a layer to her silence. She thought back to the moment when the flight attendant told her his name, to the panic that had followed, to the desperate attempt to salvage a moment that couldn't be cleaned up. She'd been on the inside her whole life, exclusive access, invitation-only briefings, members-only lounges, and yet She had completely missed the presence of real power when it sat down beside her in row 2B. At that moment, power wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't surrounded by aides or padded with small talk. It was still, composed, informed, unbothered by approval. And that disturbed her in a way she didn't fully understand until now. She opened her laptop, half thinking she'd draft something herself, a letter, a message, even just a reflection. But the screen felt heavier than usual. Her fingers hovered above the keys and didn't move. What was there to say that hadn't already been said better by someone watching? She closed the lid. Outside the hotel, a group of students marched peacefully through the street. They held no signs. They carried no slogans, just unity. Word had spread quickly. President Traoré had flown commercial again, choosing to sit among the people once more. He hadn't said a word about her, not on record, not in private, not in whispers. And that, more than anything, told her the kind of man he was. He didn't need revenge. He didn't want attention. He didn't capitalize on her mistake. He just moved on. But the world didn't. In a community center on the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso, a teacher brought up the story during a civic lesson. "This is leadership," she told her students. "Not the woman, but the man who stayed silent when he could have shamed her. The one who wore his humility like armor." In a podcast recorded in Dakar, a journalist asked, "How many people like Alina walk into our spaces every day, assuming ownership over what they don't understand?" And in thousands of households across Burkina Faso, people retold the story, not as gossip, but as evidence. Evidence that the new generation of leadership wasn't here to entertain Western norms. They were here to change the terms completely. As for Alina, she requested an earlier flight home. Her company accepted the request. Quietly, no public reprimand, just distance. She left the country 2 days later, unnoticed. No press, no farewell meeting, no final statement. But long after she disappeared from the headlines, the story lived on, because it wasn't about her anymore. It was about what her moment revealed. And some revelations never go back into hiding once the world has seen them. Weeks passed, but the story stayed. Not in front-page headlines or loud debates, but in the quiet spaces, university classrooms, WhatsApp groups, dinner tables. It took on a life of its own, not because it was scandalous, but because it felt so familiar. Everyone knew an Alina, and many had met a Traoré, though most of them didn't hold titles or govern countries. They were school teachers, taxi drivers, farmers, retired soldiers, men and women who moved through the world with quiet strength and didn't ask to be seen, only respected. That's why this moment spread. Because it wasn't just about a president being insulted on a plane. It was about who we assume deserves space, who we listen to only after we've Googled them, who we shrink from once we realize they have more power than we thought, and who, despite all that, chooses restraint over revenge. Ibrahim Traoré never mentioned the incident in public. No tweet, no statement, not even a cryptic remark during a press conference. And that silence? That silence spoke louder than any headline, because true power doesn't need to remind you who it is. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't retaliate. It doesn't perform. It holds still and lets you reveal yourself. That's exactly what happened on that flight. A woman revealed herself. A man didn't need to say much. And the rest of the world understood exactly what was going on. And that's the lesson. The way you treat someone when you think they have nothing to offer you, no connections, no name, no clout, is exactly who you are. That's not something you can rebrand. It's not something you can walk back with a polished email or a business card, because people remember how they were made to feel. And that's what will stick with Alina far longer than the flight's duration. She didn't lose her job. She wasn't dragged through the mud. But she had to live with something harder: truth. The truth that she saw a man as lesser because of his clothes, his silence, his lack of performance. And that truth? It doesn't fade. It lingers in rooms long after the people are gone. What she took from that flight is still unknown. Maybe she'll reflect. Maybe she'll change how she moves through the world. Or maybe she'll pretend it never happened. But those who witnessed it, those who heard about it, shared it, talked about it, they won't forget, because it confirmed what many already knew but don't always get to say out loud. That dignity doesn't always wear a suit. That power doesn't always come with security detail. That leadership isn't a tone, it's a choice. Every single day. So the next time someone asks you who deserves respect, don't look at their title. Look at how they carry themselves when they don't need you to notice. That's the test. And if you're ever lucky enough to sit beside someone like that, even if you don't recognize them, remember, silence isn't weakness, and stillness isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's everything you need to learn, wrapped in a moment you never saw coming. Respect isn't earned when it's convenient. It's shown when no one's watching. And for those of us who think we know what power looks like, maybe it's time we stop looking and start listening. If this story moved you, share it. Not for attention, not for numbers, but because someone you know might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We tell stories that aren't just meant to entertain, but to wake something up in you, something human.